Welcome to today's video, where we dive into a gripping and emotional story of love, betrayal, and redemption. Claire and Dan seemed to have the perfect marriage, until an affair shattered their trust and left them grappling with heartbreak and difficult choices. With emotions running high and the shadow of infidelity looming large, their journey explores the messy, raw complexities of relationships and the painful road to forgiveness. Stick around to uncover every twist and turn in this intense and unforgettable story. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more dramatic recaps like this one. It was the summer of 2015 in the quiet suburbs of Maplewood, a town where everything seemed to move at a slower pace. The streets were lined with maple trees, their vibrant green leaves swaying gently in the breeze, and the sound of kids playing in backyards filled the air. It was the kind of place where people waved at each other from their porches, and everyone knew who baked the best apple pie. For Claire Thompson, a 32-year-old elementary school teacher, this was home. She'd grown up here, built her life here, and thought she'd stay here forever. Claire was the kind of person who lit up a room without trying. She had an easy smile, the kind that made you feel like you'd known her forever, and a laugh that could turn the gloomiest day around. But behind her warm exterior was a woman stuck in the monotony of routine. Married to Dan for 8 years, Claire often found herself reflecting on how much their relationship had changed. Dan, a construction manager with a work ethic as sturdy as the buildings he oversaw, was once the love of her life. Now, he felt more like a distant roommate. Their marriage had started out like a dream. Dan would surprise Claire with flowers for no reason and whisk her away on impromptu road trips just to watch the sunset from a new angle. But life happened. Work hours piled up, bills needed paying, and the spark between them dimmed. These days, their conversations were reduced to grocery lists and who forgot to take out the trash. It wasn't bad exactly, but it wasn't good either. Claire often wondered if this was just what happened to love over time. One evening, Claire sat on the porch swing of their modest 2-story home, sipping a glass of wine as the sun dipped below the horizon. The house behind her was quiet, save for the faint hum of the TV in the living room where Dan was catching up on his favorite crime drama. She traced the rim of her glass with her finger, her thoughts drifting. She loved Dan, she knew that much, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. It was during one of these reflective evenings that Claire received a text message from an old high school friend, Adam. The notification lit up her phone screen, momentarily pulling her out of her thoughts. Adam had been one of those boys everyone liked. Charming, funny, and just a little bit cocky. Back in high school, they'd been close, sharing inside jokes and late-night phone calls about everything and nothing. After graduation, Adam moved to the city for college, and their lives took different paths. They hadn't spoken in years. "Hey, Claire, long time. No, see, I'm in town for a bit. Would love to catch up coffee?" Claire stared at the message, a mix of surprise and curiosity swirling inside her. It wasn't every day that someone from her past reached out, and the idea of catching up sounded harmless enough. Besides, a small part of her longed for a conversation that didn't involve grocery budgets or plumbing repairs. She replied after a moment of hesitation, "Hey, Adam. Wow, it has been a while. Coffee sounds great. When and where?" The following Saturday, Claire found herself sitting at a cozy cafe on Main Street, the scent of freshly brewed coffee and baked goods wafting through the air. She felt a mix of excitement and nervousness as she waited, stirring her latte absently. When Adam walked in, his presence was just as magnetic as she remembered. He looked different, older, sure, but his easy grin and confident stride hadn't changed a bit. "Claire Thompson," he said, his voice warm and familiar as he slid into the seat across from her. "Still as radiant as ever," Claire laughed, a faint blush creeping into her cheeks. "You're too kind, Adam. It's good to see you." They talked for hours, catching up on old memories and filling each other in on the years they'd missed. Adam worked in marketing now, traveling often but never staying in one place too long. He had stories for days about the people he'd met, the places he'd been, and the things he'd learned. Claire listened intently, hanging on to his every word. His life seemed so full of adventure, so different from her own predictable routine. Somewhere between the third laugh and the second refill of coffee, Claire realized she hadn't felt this alive in years. Adam had a way of making her feel seen, like she wasn't just a wife or a teacher, but a person with dreams and aspirations. When they finally parted ways, Adam hugged her tightly, lingering just a moment longer than necessary. "Let's not let another decade go by without catching up," he said, his eyes locking onto hers. Claire nodded, smiling despite the butterflies in her stomach. "Definitely." Over the next few weeks, Claire and Adam stayed in touch. Their text conversations were light-hearted at first, filled with jokes and reminiscing about the past. But as time went on, their exchanges grew deeper, more personal. Claire found herself looking forward to his messages, her heart skipping a beat whenever her phone buzzed. She knew it was dangerous. Harmless, she told herself, but dangerous. At home, Dan started noticing the changes. Claire seemed happier, more vibrant, but also more distant. She spent more time on her phone, often smiling at messages she didn't share. Their evenings, once spent together on the couch, were now divided. Claire retreating to the bedroom with her laptop, claiming she needed to plan lessons for school. One evening, as Claire was brushing her hair in the bathroom, Dan leaned against the doorway, his arms crossed. "You've been spending a lot of time on your phone lately," he said, his tone casual but edged with curiosity. Claire froze for a split second before forcing a smile. "Just catching up with an old friend," she said lightly, avoiding his gaze. Dan raised an eyebrow. "An old friend, huh? Anyone I know?" She shrugged, focusing on detangling a stubborn knot in her hair. "Adam, from high school. He's in town for a bit." Dan nodded slowly but didn't say anything more. He turned and walked away, leaving Claire to wrestle with the knot in her hair and the growing one in her chest. As the weeks passed, Claire's interactions with Adam became more frequent. They started meeting for coffee regularly, and their conversations drifted into territory that felt increasingly intimate. Adam was attentive in a way that made Claire's heart ache. He asked about her dreams, her fears, the things she felt she couldn't share with anyone else, and when he looked at her, it was as if she were the only person in the world. One evening, after yet another late-night texting session with Adam, Claire lay in bed staring at the ceiling. Dan was asleep beside her, his breathing slow and steady. She felt a pang of guilt as she glanced at him, but it was quickly overshadowed by the thrill she felt when she thought of Adam. She knew she was walking a fine line, but she couldn't bring herself to stop. Adam made her feel alive in a way she hadn't felt in years. And then it happened. It was a rainy Wednesday afternoon when Adam suggested they meet at his hotel room to go over a marketing project he was working on. Claire hesitated, knowing full well what it could mean. But Adam's charm was irresistible, and the idea of spending more time with him, away from the watchful eyes of the world, was too tempting to resist. Claire parked her car outside the modest hotel, the rain tapping softly on the windshield as if urging her to reconsider. She gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles turning white, and stared at the glowing vacancy sign through the misty glass. Her heart thudded in her chest, a relentless rhythm that mirrored the battle in her mind. Was this a step too far, a line she wasn't ready to cross? But then she thought of Adam, his smile, his words, the way he made her feel alive, like the version of herself she'd lost somewhere along the way. The excitement outweighed the guilt, and before she could talk herself out of it, Claire grabbed her bag and stepped out into the rain. Inside, the hotel lobby smelled faintly of cleaning products and fresh coffee. Adam was waiting for her near the elevator, his smile warm, but charged with a tension that sent shivers up Claire's spine. "Hey," he said, his voice low, as if they were already sharing a secret. "Hey," she replied, her own voice unsteady. The ride up to his room was quiet, the kind of quiet that was too loud. The ding of the elevator and the soft scuff of their shoes on the carpeted hallway filled the air between them. When they reached his room, Adam held the door open, his eyes never leaving hers as she stepped inside. The room was standard, beige walls, a desk in the corner, and a bed that seemed too big for its surroundings. Claire stood by the window, looking out at the rain-soaked street below, her back to Adam. She felt him move closer, the warmth of his presence brushing against her. "Claire," he murmured, his voice filled with something she couldn't quite place. Was it excitement? Regret? Desire? She turned to face him, her heart racing as the distance between them disappeared. His hand brushed her cheek, tentative but sure, and then his lips found hers. The kiss was electric, a spark that ignited something deep inside her. For a moment all the guilt, the doubt, the hesitation melted away, leaving only the thrill of the moment. But as quickly as it started, reality came crashing back. Claire pulled away, her breath uneven, and turned back toward the window. "I can't. I don't know if I can do this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Adam placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch both grounding and overwhelming. "You don't have to do anything you're not ready for," he said, his tone softer now. "But if you're here, it's because you want it to be." His words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Claire closed her eyes, fighting back the tears that threatened to spill. She didn't answer, but when Adam wrapped his arms around her, she didn't pull away. Back at home, Dan was starting to feel the cracks in their marriage widening. He wasn't the kind of man who wore his emotions on his sleeve, but Claire's increasing distance had begun to eat at him. She was spending more nights, working late, or out with friends, her phone constantly lighting up with notifications she didn't share. Dan tried to brush it off, convincing himself that it was just a phase, that Claire was stressed or distracted, not distant for any deeper reason. But the doubt lingered. He started paying closer attention, the way she smiled at her phone, the subtle changes in her appearance, new perfume, an extra coat of mascara, outfits she hadn't worn in years. One evening, as they sat down to dinner, Dan decided to bring it up. "You've been busy a lot lately," he said, his tone casual but probing. "Work keeping you late?" Claire froze for half a second before answering. "Yeah, it's just this new curriculum we're rolling out, lots of moving parts." Dan nodded, his expression unreadable. "You know, you can tell me if something's going on." Her eyes flicked to his, the words catching in her throat. "Nothing's going on," she said quickly. Too quickly. "Why would you think that?" Dan held her gaze for a moment before looking away, his appetite suddenly gone. "No reason," he muttered, but the tension between them was impossible to ignore. As the days turned into weeks, Claire and Adam's relationship deepened. What had started as coffee dates and late-night texts had escalated into stolen moments in hotel rooms, each encounter more intoxicating than the last. Claire told herself it wasn't a full-blown affair, not yet, but the boundaries she'd once held firm were now little more than distant memories. At work, Claire found herself distracted, her thoughts drifting to Adam during meetings and lesson planning. Her colleagues noticed the change, commenting on how she seemed happier, lighter. And in a way, she was Adam made her feel special, like she was more than just a wife and a teacher. But the shadow of guilt loomed larger with each passing day. One afternoon, as Claire was grading papers in her classroom, her phone buzzed with a text from Adam. "Thinking about, you can't wait to see you tonight." She smiled despite herself, the excitement bubbling up even as she shoved the phone back into her bag. But that night, as she slipped out of the house with a vague excuse about meeting a friend, Dan's suspicion boiled over. He waited until she was gone before grabbing her laptop from the kitchen counter, his hands shaking as he opened it. Claire had always been careful about covering her tracks, but tonight, she'd left her email logged in. What Dan found there changed everything. The next morning, Claire woke up to find Dan already dressed, his face unreadable as he sipped his coffee at the kitchen table. She greeted him cautiously, sensing the storm brewing beneath his calm exterior. "Morning," she said, pouring herself a cup. Dan didn't look up. "We need to talk." The words sent a chill down her spine. She set her mug down slowly, her heart pounding. "About what?" He finally met her gaze, his eyes filled with hurt and anger. "About this," he said, sliding her phone across the table. The screen was lit up, displaying a message thread she knew all too well. Claire's breath caught as the blood drained from her face. "Dan, I can explain." "Can you?" he interrupted, his voice rising. "Because from where I'm standing it looks like you've been lying to me for weeks, maybe months." Tears filled her eyes as she reached for him, but he stepped back, shaking his head. "Don't," he said, his voice breaking. I trusted you, Claire. I thought we were a team. We are, she said desperately, her voice trembling. Dan, I love you. This isn't what it looks like. Then what is it? He demanded. Because it sure as hell looks like you've been cheating on me. The silence that followed was deafening. Claire's tears fell freely now, her hands trembling as she tried to find the words to explain. But there was nothing she could say to make it better. The truth was out, and it was as devastating as she'd feared. As Dan walked out of the house that morning, slamming the door behind him, Claire collapsed onto the couch, her sobs echoing through the empty room she'd spent so long trying to convince herself that she could keep her life with Dan and her relationship with Adam separate. But now it was clear that she'd only been fooling herself. The fallout was swift and brutal. Dan moved out that same week, taking only what he needed and leaving the rest behind. Claire tried calling him, texting him, begging him to talk to her, but he refused. The man who had once been her rock, her partner, was now a stranger, and it was all her fault. Adam, for his part, offered little comfort. When Claire told him what had happened, he was sympathetic but distant. I didn't mean for this to happen, he said one evening as they sat together in his car. I never wanted to hurt anyone. You think I did? Claire shot back, her voice filled with anger and desperation. I've lost everything, Adam. My marriage, my home, everything. Adam sighed, running a hand through his hair. Maybe we should take a step back, he said finally. This is getting complicated. The words stung more than Claire expected. She stared at him, her heart sinking as she realized the truth. Adam had been an escape, a fantasy, but he wasn't her future, and now she had nothing left. At this point in the story, it's hard not to feel for Claire, even if you don't agree with her choices. Life is messy, and sometimes the lines between right and wrong get blurry. But what happens next? Will Claire find a way to rebuild her life? Or will she continue to spiral? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss the next part of this story. Claire sat alone in her darkened living room, the flickering light of the TV casting long shadows on the walls. The house, once filled with warmth and laughter, now felt cold and hollow, as if the life had been drained from it. Dan's absence was palpable, each empty chair and unused coffee mug a painful reminder of what she'd lost. She replayed their last conversation in her mind, her heart aching with every word. I trusted you, Claire. The look in Dan's eyes, the raw betrayal, was something she knew she'd never forget. The guilt was suffocating, but beneath it was something even more insidious, a gnawing sense of regret, not just for what she'd done, but for what she'd let herself become. Her phone buzzed on the table, breaking the silence. It was Adam. She hesitated before picking it up. Their conversations had grown strained in the days since Dan left. What once felt thrilling and new now carried the weight of her unraveling life. Hey, you okay? The message read. Claire stared at the screen, her thumb hovering over the keyboard. What could she even say? That she was falling apart. That the excitement she'd once felt with him had turned to ash. She typed out a quick reply. I'm fine. Just need some time to think. Meanwhile, Dan was trying to piece his life back together. He'd moved into a small apartment across town, the bare walls and minimal furniture reflecting his mood. He buried himself in work, staying late at the office and volunteering for extra projects just to keep his mind occupied. But no matter how hard he tried, thoughts of Claire crept in. One evening, as he sat at his desk, his phone buzzed with a notification. It was a text from Sarah, a mutual friend of his and Claire's. Hey, just checking in. How are you holding up? Dan hesitated before responding. Sarah had always been kind and understanding, and she'd been one of the first to reach out after news of his separation spread. He decided to reply honestly. I'm managing. Some days are better than others. If you ever need to talk, I'm here, Sarah wrote back. Dan stared at the message, his finger hovering over the screen. He wasn't sure if he was ready to talk, but the offer was tempting. After a moment, he typed, Thanks, I might take you up on that. For Claire, the days blurred into weeks. She threw herself into her work, taking on extra responsibilities and volunteering for after-school programs to fill the void. But no matter how busy she kept herself, the weight of her decisions hung over her like a storm cloud. Her relationship with Adam had cooled significantly. Their once passionate conversations had turned into stilted exchanges, and their meetings became fewer and farther between. It was clear that whatever spark they'd had was fading, and Claire couldn't decide whether she was relieved or heartbroken. One evening, as she sat grading papers at her kitchen table, there was a knock at the door. Her heart leapt in her chest. Could it be Dan? She rushed to open it, only to find Adam standing there, his hands shoved into his pockets. "Hey," he said, his voice soft. "Can we talk?" Claire stepped aside, letting him in. Adam paced the living room, his expression troubled. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," he began, running a hand through his hair. "About us, about everything." Claire crossed her arms, her stomach twisting. "And?" Adam sighed. "I don't think this is working anymore. I mean, I care about you, Claire, but it's not what I thought it would be." The words hit her like a punch to the gut, even though she'd seen it coming. "So that's it?" she said, her voice shaking. "You're just walking away?" "I'm sorry," Adam said, his eyes filled with regret. "I never wanted to hurt you." Claire let out a bitter laugh. "Too late for that." As Adam left, Claire sank onto the couch, her head in her hands. She'd lost everything: Dan, Adam, the life she'd built. And now she was left to pick up the pieces alone. Across town, Dan was beginning to open up to Sarah. They met for coffee one evening, the familiar warmth of her smile easing the tension in his chest. "I don't know how you're even standing," Sarah said, her tone both sympathetic and impressed. "If it were me, I'd probably still be in bed." Dan chuckled, the sound feeling foreign but welcome. "I don't know if I'm standing so much as stumbling," he admitted. "But I guess that's part of the process, right?" Sarah nodded, her eyes softening. "It is, and you're doing better than you think." As they talked, Dan felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope Sarah didn't push him to share more than he was comfortable with, but her presence was steady and reassuring. For the first time since the split, Dan allowed himself to consider the possibility of moving on. One evening, Claire sat alone in the empty house, scrolling through old photos on her phone. Pictures of her and Dan filled the screen, their smiles wide and genuine. She paused on one from their honeymoon, taken on a beach at sunset. They looked so happy, so in love. Tears welled in her eyes as she realized how far they'd drifted from that moment. She decided then and there that she couldn't let things end like this. She needed to talk to Dan, to apologize, to try and make amends, even if it was too late to fix what they'd had. The next morning, Claire drove to Dan's apartment. Her hands shook as she knocked on the door, her heart pounding in her chest. When Dan opened it, his expression was a mix of surprise and guardedness. "Claire," he said, his tone neutral, "what are you doing here?" I needed to see you," she said, her voice trembling. "Can I come in?" Dan hesitated before stepping aside, letting her in. The apartment was small but tidy, and Claire's heart ached at the sight of his life without her. They sat across from each other at the kitchen table, the silence heavy between them. Claire took a deep breath, her hands clenched in her lap. "I know I'm the last person you want to hear from," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I need to say this. I'm sorry, Dan, for everything." Dan's jaw tightened, his eyes fixed on the table. "You broke my trust, Claire," he said finally, his voice steady but filled with pain. "I don't know if I can ever get that back." "I know," Claire said, tears streaming down her face. "And I don't expect you to forgive me, but I had to tell you how much I regret what I did. You didn't deserve this." Dan looked at her, his expression softening slightly. "I loved you, Claire. I still do. But love isn't always enough." The weight of his words hung in the air, and Claire knew there was nothing she could say to change his mind. She'd made her choices, and now she had to live with the consequences. At this point, the story has reached its boiling point, with emotions running high and the stakes at their peak. How do you think things will play out for Claire and Dan? Can there ever be forgiveness, or is this truly the end of their story? Share your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss the next part of this gripping tale. Claire left Dan's apartment feeling like the world had closed in on her. The rawness in his voice, the way he said, "Love isn't always enough," played on a loop in her mind. She knew she deserved this, deserved to feel the weight of her mistakes, but knowing didn't make it any easier. She sat in her car, staring at the steering wheel, willing herself not to cry. But the tears came anyway, hot and relentless. She gripped the wheel tighter, the realization hitting her like a tidal wave. This wasn't just about losing Dan, it was about losing herself, her integrity, her sense of worth. She had been so caught up in chasing the fleeting thrill of Adam's attention that she'd let go of everything that truly mattered. For the first time in weeks, Claire didn't try to distract herself from the pain. She let it wash over her, wave after wave, until she was left with nothing but a hollow ache and a burning question. What do I do now? Meanwhile, Dan was grappling with his own internal storm. After Claire left, he sat alone in his apartment, replaying their conversation. Her apology had been heartfelt, her tears genuine, but the wounds she'd inflicted were still too fresh. Could he forgive her? Should he? It wasn't just about the betrayal. It was about the years they'd spent together, the memories they'd made, and the life they'd built. He missed her, missed the way she used to laugh at his corny jokes, the way she'd fall asleep with her head on his shoulder during movie nights. But every time he thought about taking her back, the image of her with Adam burned in his mind like a brand. Dan poured himself a drink, staring out the window at the city lights. Sarah's words from their last coffee date echoed in his mind. "You deserve to be happy, Dan. Don't settle for less than you deserve." The question was, could happiness ever mean rebuilding something that had been broken so completely? As the days passed, Claire threw herself into therapy. She'd started seeing a counselor shortly after Dan left, but now, for the first time, she began to take the process seriously. Her sessions were raw, uncomfortable, but necessary. "I think I've spent my whole life trying to make other people happy," Claire admitted one afternoon, her voice trembling. "And somewhere along the way, I forgot how to make myself happy." Her therapist nodded, her expression gentle but firm. "What does happiness look like to you, Claire? Not for anyone else. For you." The question caught Claire off guard. She'd been so focused on the damage she'd caused, the people she'd hurt, that she hadn't stopped to consider what she wanted. The thought scared her, but it also sparked a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, she could find a way forward. Adam, on the other hand, had all but vanished from Claire's life. After their final conversation, he stopped texting, stopped calling. It was as if their affair had never happened. At first, Claire felt angry. How could he just walk away, unscathed, while she was left to pick up the pieces? But over time, her anger turned to indifference. Adam wasn't her problem anymore. She had bigger battles to fight. One evening, while organizing the bookshelves in her living room, Claire came across an old photo album. She hesitated before opening it, the memories inside both comforting and painful. Page after page, she saw the story of her life with Dan. Their wedding day, their first vacation, the time they painted their bedroom and ended up covered in more paint than the walls. The images brought a lump to her throat, but they also reminded her of something important. She and Dan had been happy once, truly happy, and while she couldn't undo the past, she owed it to herself and to him to try and honor what they'd had. One day, Dan received an unexpected call from Sarah. "Hey, you free for lunch?" she asked, her tone light but warm. Dan hesitated. He'd been leaning on Sarah more and more lately, finding solace in her friendship, but he wasn't sure if he was ready for something more. Still, he agreed. "Yeah, sure, where should we meet?" They chose a small diner on the outskirts of town, a place neither of them had been before. As they sat across from each other, Sarah reached across the table and placed a hand on Dan's. "You've been through so much," she said softly, "but you're stronger than you think." Dan looked at her, his chest tightening. "I don't feel strong," he admitted. "Most days, I feel like I'm barely holding it together." "That's what makes you strong," Sarah said, her eyes steady. "You're still here, still fighting." Their conversation drifted to lighter topics after that. Work, hobbies, plans for the weekend. But Dan couldn't shake the warmth he felt from Sarah's words. She made him feel seen, understood. It was a feeling he hadn't realized he'd been craving. Claire's journey toward redemption hit a major turning point one evening when she received an email from the school principal. "Claire, I'd like to discuss your future with us," it read. The message was brief, but left her stomach in knots. Was she about to lose her job too? The next morning, Claire walked into the principal's office, her heart pounding. "You wanted to see me?" she asked, her voice unsteady. The principal gestured for her to sit. "Claire, you've always been one of our most dedicated teachers," she began. "But lately I've noticed you've been distracted." Claire's face burned with shame. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I know I've been off my game, but I'm working on it, I swear." The principal nodded. "I can see that, and I want to help you get back on track, but you need to decide what's most important to you, Claire. Your students deserve the best version of you." Her words hit Claire like a wake-up call. Teaching had always been her passion, her purpose. She couldn't let her personal life continue to overshadow her professional one. That night, she sat down and made a list of goals. Small, manageable steps to rebuild not just her career, but herself. The climax of this story comes to a head when Claire and Dan cross paths unexpectedly at a mutual friend's birthday party. Neither of them had planned to attend, but fate, or perhaps the universe, had other ideas. Claire spotted Dan from across the room, her heart skipping a beat. He looked good, better than she remembered, but the sight of him also brought a wave of guilt crashing over her. She considered leaving, but before she could, Dan noticed her. Their eyes met, and for a moment, everything else faded away. Slowly, Dan made his way over to her, his expression unreadable. "Claire," he said, his voice neutral, "I didn't expect to see you here." "Me neither," she admitted, her hands fidgeting nervously. "How have you been?" Dan hesitated before answering. "Better taking it one day at a time." "Me too," Claire said softly. "I'm really sorry, Dan, for everything." "I know you are," he replied, "and I appreciate that, but saying sorry doesn't change what happened." "I know," Claire said, her voice breaking. I wish I could go back and fix it." Dan sighed, his shoulders relaxing slightly. "We can't go back, Claire, but maybe we can figure out how to move forward." The conversation was brief, but it left both of them feeling lighter, as if a weight they'd been carrying for months had finally started to lift. And with that, the story reaches its most critical turning point. What happens next will determine the fate of Claire and Dan's relationship. Will they find a way to rebuild, or is this truly the end of their story? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss the next part of this emotional journey. The party had left Claire shaken. Seeing Dan after so many weeks of silence had been like reopening an old wound. Yet, there was something about the way he'd looked at her, calm, steady, but distant, that cut even deeper. It was the same look she'd seen in the mirror every morning, a mixture of hurt and resolve. Driving home that night, Claire replayed their conversation over and over. "We can't go back, but maybe we can figure out how to move forward." What had he meant? Was there a chance for them, or was he simply looking for closure? The ambiguity gnawed at her. She pulled into her driveway, the house looming dark and silent before her. As she stepped inside, the weight of her solitude pressed against her. For months, she'd avoided sitting with her feelings, distracting herself with work, therapy, and the fleeting connection she'd had with Adam. But tonight, there was no escaping it. She sank onto the couch, her thoughts racing as tears spilled down her cheeks. If there was any hope of moving forward, whether with Dan or on her own, she needed to confront her past head-on. Dan, too, found himself consumed by their encounter. After leaving the party, he drove aimlessly through the quiet streets of town, the memories of his marriage swirling in his mind. He thought about the early days, the way Claire's laughter had been like music to his ears, the quiet mornings they'd spent curled up on the couch, and the dreams they'd once shared. Those moments felt like a lifetime ago. Pulling into a diner he used to frequent, Dan ordered a coffee and sat by the window, staring out at the rain. He wasn't angry anymore. Not at Claire, not at Adam, not even at himself. But he was tired. Tired of carrying the weight of what had happened. Tired of letting the past dictate his future. As he sipped his coffee, he thought about Sarah. Her friendship had been a lifeline in the chaos of the last few months, her unwavering support helping him find his footing again. But what did that mean? Was she just a friend? Or was there the potential for something more? The thought scared him, but it also sparked a flicker of hope. Maybe moving forward didn't have to mean moving on alone. The days that followed were a whirlwind of emotions for both Claire and Dan. For Claire, the encounter at the party had reignited a determination she hadn't felt in months. She threw herself into therapy with renewed focus, digging deep into the patterns and insecurities that had led her down such a destructive path. It wasn't easy. Her therapist pushed her to confront uncomfortable truths, and there were days when she left sessions feeling more broken than before. But slowly, she began to see a glimmer of light at the end of the tunnel. One afternoon, as Claire sat in her therapist's office, the topic of forgiveness came up. "Do you think Dan will ever forgive me?" she asked, her voice trembling. Her therapist studied her for a moment before responding. "That's not something you can control. Claire, forgiveness is his journey, not yours. The question is, can you forgive yourself?" The words hit Claire like a punch to the gut. She'd spent so much time seeking absolution from Dan that she hadn't stopped to consider what it would take to forgive herself. That night, she wrote a letter, not to Dan, but to herself. In it, she poured out all the pain, guilt, and regret she'd been carrying, along with a promise to do better. By the time she finished, she felt a small but significant shift inside her. It wasn't closure, but it was a start. For Dan, the turning point came during a long conversation with Sarah. They were sitting on the porch of her house, a warm breeze rustling the leaves around them. "You're holding on to a lot of pain, Dan," Sarah said gently. "It's okay to let go." Dan stared out at the trees, his jaw clenched. "It's not that easy." "I know it's not," Sarah replied. "But forgiveness isn't about excusing what happened. It's about freeing yourself from it." Dan sighed, running a hand through his hair. "What if I don't know how?" Sarah reached over, placing a hand on his arm. "Start small one day, one moment at a time." Her words stayed with Dan long after their conversation ended. That night, as he sat alone in his apartment, he picked up his phone and opened his messages. For a moment, he hesitated, but then, with a deep breath, he typed a short message to Claire. "Would you like to meet for coffee? I think we need to talk." When Claire received Dan's message, her heart skipped a beat. She stared at the screen, her emotions a whirlwind of hope and fear. After everything that had happened, was there really anything left to say? But she knew she couldn't let the opportunity pass her by. She replied quickly, "Yes, when and where?" They agreed to meet at a quiet cafe downtown, the same place where they'd had their first date all those years ago. As Claire walked through the door, her nerves were on edge. Dan was already there, sitting at a table near the window. He looked up as she approached, offering a small, tentative smile. "Hi," she said, her voice soft. "Hi," he replied, gesturing for her to sit. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence heavy, but not entirely uncomfortable. Finally, Dan broke the ice. "Thank you for meeting me." "Of course," Claire said. "Thank you for asking." Dan took a deep breath, his hands clasped around his coffee cup. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," he began. "About us, about what happened, about everything." Claire nodded, her throat tightening. "Me too." "I'm not going to lie, Claire. What you did hurt me in ways I didn't even know I could be hurt," Dan said, his voice steady but laced with emotion. "But I also know that holding on to that hurt isn't helping either of us." Tears filled Claire's eyes as she listened. "Dan, I'm so sorry," she said, her voice breaking. "I know I can't undo what I did, But I want you to know how much I regret it. You didn't deserve any of it. Dan nodded, his gaze meeting hers. I believe you, and I think, for the first time, I'm ready to forgive you. Claire's breath caught, a mix of relief and disbelief washing over her. You are? Yes, Dan said. But forgiving doesn't mean forgetting, and it doesn't mean we can go back to the way things were. I understand, Claire said quickly. I don't expect anything, Dan. I want you to be happy, whether that's with me or without me. Dan studied her for a long moment before speaking. I think we both deserve to be happy, and maybe, just maybe, we can figure out what that looks like together. As they left the cafe, the weight of their conversation began to lift. It wasn't a perfect resolution. There were still wounds to heal, trust to rebuild, but it was a start. For the first time in months, Claire felt a glimmer of hope, not just for her relationship with Dan, but for herself. Back at home, Claire sat down at her kitchen table and opened her journal. She wrote about the meeting, about the emotions swirling inside her, and about the future she was beginning to imagine. It wasn't a clean slate, but it was enough. Dan, too, felt a sense of cautious optimism as he drove home. He thought about Claire's words, about the vulnerability in her voice, and about the person she was trying to become. He didn't know what the future held, but he was willing to take it one step at a time. And there it is, the moment that changes everything. Claire and Dan have faced their darkest days, and are finally beginning to find their way back to the light. But will they be able to rebuild their relationship, or will the scars of the past prove too deep to overcome? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter in this emotional journey. The days following Claire and Dan's conversation at the cafe were filled with cautious optimism, but neither of them underestimated the challenges ahead. They had agreed to take things slowly, to figure out if they could rebuild the trust and love that had been shattered. But trust, once broken, wasn't easy to repair. For Claire, each day felt like walking a tightrope. She knew she had to prove to Dan, not just with words, but with actions, that she was committed to making things right. She started by being honest, painfully so. There were no more excuses, no more half-truths. When she wasn't sure how to say something, she said it anyway, knowing that the risk of awkwardness was better than the risk of losing Dan again. Dan, on the other hand, found himself battling a whirlwind of emotions. Forgiving Claire had been a conscious choice, but forgetting was something entirely different. Every time he looked at her, he saw glimpses of the woman he'd fallen in love with, but also flashes of the betrayal that had driven them apart. He wanted to believe they could rebuild, but doubt lingered like a shadow at the edges of his mind. The first test of their fragile reconciliation came during a family dinner. Dan's parents, unaware of the turmoil that had upended their marriage, invited them both over for an evening of food and conversation. Claire hesitated when Dan mentioned it. "Are you sure that's a good idea?" she asked, her voice tinged with worry. "I don't want to make things awkward." Dan shrugged, though his expression was far from indifferent. "They miss you, and honestly, it's time we see how this works in the real world." The dinner was tense. Claire was hyper-aware of every word she spoke, every gesture she made, worried that Dan's parents might sense the cracks beneath the surface. Dan's mother, ever perceptive, picked up on the strain. "Is everything okay between you two?" she asked gently, her eyes flicking between Claire and Dan. There was a pause before Dan nodded. "We're working through some things," he said honestly. "But we're trying." His mother smiled, her gaze softening. "That's all anyone can do, sweetheart." It was a small moment, but it gave Claire a glimmer of hope. Maybe they didn't have to pretend everything was perfect. Maybe it was enough to just try. As the weeks went on, Claire and Dan began carving out a new normal. They started going on small dates, dinners at quiet restaurants, walks in the park, trips to the farmer's market. Each outing was a test, an opportunity to rediscover each other and rebuild the connection that had once come so easily. One evening, as they sat on a bench overlooking the lake, Dan broke the comfortable silence between them. "Do you remember the first time we came here?" he asked, a small smile tugging at his lips. Claire nodded, her heart swelling with nostalgia. Of course you packed that ridiculous picnic with the soggy sandwiches and the melted chocolate. Dan laughed, the sound warm and genuine. Hey, I was trying to be romantic. And you were, Claire said softly, her eyes meeting his. You always were. The moment hung between them, fragile but meaningful. It wasn't a declaration of love, but it was a step, a reminder of the good that still lingered between them. But not everything was smooth sailing. One afternoon, as Claire was cleaning out the garage, she stumbled across a box of old photos and letters. At the bottom was a card from Adam, a note he'd written to her during their affair. The sight of it made her stomach twist, a painful reminder of her mistakes. She considered throwing it away immediately, but something stopped her. Instead, she sat down on the cold cement floor, the card trembling in her hands. The words inside, once thrilling, now felt hollow and meaningless. She realized, with startling clarity, that Adam had never truly been the answer to her unhappiness. He'd been an escape, a distraction from the parts of herself she hadn't wanted to face. Without another thought, she tore the card into tiny pieces, each shred feeling like a small act of liberation. When Dan came home later that evening, she told him what had happened. I found something from Adam, she admitted, her voice steady despite the knot in her chest. I got rid of it, I thought you should know. Dan studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Thank you for telling me, he said finally. That means a lot. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was a step toward transparency, and Claire clung to that. The turning point came one stormy night, when an unexpected power outage plunged their house into darkness. Claire and Dan had been in the middle of dinner, the flicker of candlelight the only source of illumination as rain lashed against the windows. It's kind of romantic, Claire said with a nervous laugh, trying to lighten the mood. Dan raised an eyebrow, his lips quirking into a half-smile. If you ignore the fact that the fridge is probably going to defrost, sure. They finished their meal in relative silence, the sound of the storm filling the gaps in their conversation. But as they cleared the table, Dan stopped suddenly, his hand resting on the edge of the counter. Claire, he said, his voice low but steady. Can I ask you something? Of course, she replied, her heart skipping a beat. Why Adam? The question was simple, but the weight of it hung heavy in the air. Claire took a deep breath, her gaze dropping to the floor. Because I was lonely, she admitted. Because I felt invisible and he made me feel seen. But it wasn't real, Dan. It wasn't what I wanted. Not really. Dan nodded slowly, his expression pensive. I needed to hear that, he said after a moment. I needed to know it wasn't about me. It wasn't, Claire said quickly. It was never about you. You're a good man, Dan. I lost myself, and I took you down with me, and I'm so sorry. For the first time in a long while, Dan felt something shift inside him. Her words didn't erase the pain, but they soothed some of the raw edges. He reached for her hand, his grip firm but gentle. I'm not promising anything, he said, but I'm willing to try. That night marked a turning point in their journey. It wasn't a clean slate, it was far from that, but it was a shared understanding, a commitment to move forward together. Over the next few weeks, they continued to rebuild, one conversation, one moment at a time. Claire started cooking dinners again, experimenting with recipes she knew Dan loved. Dan, in turn, surprised her with small gestures, a bouquet of her favorite flowers, a handwritten note left on her pillow. They weren't grand gestures, but they were meaningful, a testament to the effort they were both willing to put in. One evening, as they sat together on the couch, Dan turned to Claire with a question that had been weighing on his mind. Do you think we'll ever be the same again? Claire thought for a moment before answering. I don't think we'll ever be the same, she said honestly. But maybe that's not a bad thing. Maybe we can be something new, something stronger. Dan nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. I think I'd like that. The climax of this story isn't a single moment. It's the culmination of every decision, every conversation, every act of vulnerability that brought Claire and Dan back to this point. Their journey isn't over, but for the first time in a long while, they're facing the future together. and that's where we leave them. For now. What do you think? Can Claire and Dan truly rebuild what they've lost, or is the past too much to overcome? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter in this emotional journey. The weeks following their renewed commitment were marked by small victories, and the occasional setback. Claire and Dan worked hard to rebuild what had been shattered, but healing was not linear. Each step forward felt fragile, as if one misstep could send them tumbling back to the starting line. One evening, as they sat in their now revived tradition of watching movies on the couch, Dan received a text message. He glanced at his phone, his brow furrowing slightly. Before setting it down on the coffee table, Claire noticed but said nothing, her mind racing with possibilities. Was it work, a friend, or was it something else entirely? The tension grew unbearable until Claire finally spoke. "Everything okay?" she asked, her voice steady but laced with unease. Dan hesitated before nodding. "Yeah, just Sarah checking in," he said. The mention of Sarah brought a wave of mixed emotions for Claire. She knew Sarah had been a lifeline for Dan during their separation, and she was grateful for that. But she couldn't help but feel a pang of jealousy. Did Sarah represent the stability and support that Claire had failed to provide? Claire forced a smile. "She seems nice," she said, her tone neutral. Dan studied her for a moment, as if trying to gauge her true feelings. "She is," he said simply, "but she's just a friend, Claire. That's all." The words were meant to reassure her, but they left her feeling hollow. Claire knew she had no right to question Dan's friendships, not after everything she'd done. Yet the doubt lingered, a reminder of how fragile their relationship still was. One of the most pivotal moments came during a weekend getaway that Dan suggested. "We need a change of scenery," he said, his tone firm but kind. "Just us, no distractions." Claire agreed, though the idea filled her with both excitement and dread. A weekend alone with Dan would be an opportunity to reconnect, but it would also force them to confront the unspoken tension that still hung between them. They rented a cabin in the woods, secluded and quiet, with a view of the mountains that took Claire's breath away. The first evening was uneventful. They cooked dinner together, sharing quiet conversation and tentative smiles. But as the sun set and the stars emerged, the weight of their unspoken fears pressed down on them. Sitting by the fire, Dan finally broke the silence. "Do you ever think about what might have been?" he asked, his voice soft but filled with an undercurrent of pain. Claire's heart clenched. "What do you mean?" Dan stared into the flames, his expression unreadable. "If none of this had happened, if we just stayed the way we were." Claire hesitated before answering. "I think about it all the time," she admitted. "But I also know that we can't change the past. All we can do is decide what to do with the present." Dan nodded slowly, her words sinking in. "I want to believe that," he said. "I really do." The next day brought an unexpected challenge. While hiking along a narrow trail, Claire slipped on a patch of loose gravel, twisting her ankle. Dan was at her side in an instant, his concern etched across his face. "Are you okay?" he asked, kneeling beside her. Claire winced, tears springing to her eyes. "I think I sprained it." Without hesitation, Dan scooped her up in his arms, carrying her back down the trail. Claire protested at first, but Dan's determination was unyielding. "You're not walking on that," he said firmly. As they made their way back to the cabin, Claire couldn't help but feel a sense of déjà vu. This was the Dan she remembered, the man who had always been there for her, who would go to any length to make sure she was okay. The realization brought a lump to her throat. Despite everything, he still cared. Later that evening, as Claire rested her foot on a pillow and Dan prepared an ice pack, she found herself overwhelmed with gratitude. "Thank you," she said, her voice trembling. "For everything." Dan glanced at her, his expression softening. "You don't have to thank me," he said. "This is what we do for each other." The simplicity of his words brought tears to Claire's eyes. In that moment, she realized that rebuilding their relationship wasn't just about grand gestures or sweeping apologies. It was about the small, everyday acts of love and kindness that had always defined their bond. But the road to reconciliation was far from smooth. A week after their return from the cabin, Claire received an unexpected message from Adam. It was short and cryptic. "Thinking about you. Hope you're doing well." The sight of his name on her phone screen sent a jolt through Claire. She stared at the message, her mind racing. Why was he reaching out now? What did he want? After a moment of hesitation, she deleted the message without responding. That evening, as she and Dan sat down to dinner, Claire wrestled with whether to tell him. Part of her wanted to keep it to herself, to avoid stirring up unnecessary tension. But another part of her knew that honesty was the only way forward. "I got a message from Adam today," she said finally, her voice steady despite the anxiety bubbling beneath the surface. Dan's fork froze halfway to his mouth. He set it down slowly, his eyes locking onto hers. "What did it say?" "Just that he was thinking about me," Claire said. "I deleted it. I didn't respond." Dan's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "Thank you for telling me," he said after a long pause. "It means a lot." Claire reached across the table, her hand brushing his. "You're the only one I want, Dan," she said, her voice filled with conviction. "I need you to know that." Dan's expression softened, and he squeezed her hand. "I do," he said, "but trust takes time, Claire, and I'm still working on it." The climax of their journey came during a couples counseling session that Dan suggested. Claire agreed, though the idea of sharing their struggles with a stranger made her uneasy. Still, she knew they needed help navigating the complexities of their relationship. The counselor, a calm and empathetic woman named Dr. Evans, guided them through exercises designed to foster communication and understanding. At first, the sessions were tense, filled with moments of defensiveness and frustration. But as the weeks went on, Claire and Dan began to open up in ways they hadn't before. During one particularly emotional session, Dan admitted something he'd been holding back. "I was scared," he said, his voice shaking. "Scared that I wasn't enough for you. That no matter what I did, it would never be enough." Claire's heart broke at his words. "Dan, it was never about you," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I was the one who wasn't enough. I let my insecurities get the better of me, and I hurt you because of it. And I'll regret that for the rest of my life." Dr. Evans intervened gently, guiding them toward a place of mutual understanding. "Forgiveness is a process," she said, "and so is healing. But the fact that you're both here, willing to do the work, speaks volumes." As Claire and Dan left the counseling office that evening, the air between them felt lighter. They weren't fixed, far from it, but they were making progress, and for the first time in a long while, that felt like enough. The story has reached its boiling point, with emotions running high and the stakes at their peak. What do you think? Can Claire and Dan overcome the lingering shadows of their past, or will the weight of their history prove too much? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter in this powerful journey. As the counseling sessions continued, Claire and Dan started to find a rhythm, albeit a shaky one. Each session peeled back another layer of hurt, another misunderstanding, and another piece of their fractured foundation. But with every revelation came an opportunity to rebuild. They weren't just piecing their marriage back together. They were learning to see each other with new eyes. One evening, after a particularly emotional session, Dan suggested they take a walk in the park. The air was crisp, the faint scent of autumn leaves lingering as they strolled along the path. Claire hugged her coat tighter around herself, the silence between them comforting but heavy with unspoken thoughts. "I've been thinking a lot about forgiveness," Dan said finally, his voice steady but contemplative. Claire glanced at him, her heart quickening. "Yeah?" Dan nodded, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. "Not just forgiving you, but forgiving myself." The words caught Claire off guard. "Yourself for what?" "For not seeing it," Dan said, his gaze fixed on the ground ahead. "For not realizing how unhappy you were, for letting things get so bad without doing something about it." Claire stopped walking, turning to face him. "Dan, none of this is your fault," she said firmly. "You were a good husband. I was the one who messed up, not you." Dan met her eyes, his expression filled with both pain and hope. "Maybe, but I wasn't perfect either, and if we're going to move forward, I have to let go of the guilt I've been carrying." Claire reached for his hand, her fingers threading through his. "We'll figure it out," she said softly. "Together." But just when things seemed to be improving, an unexpected twist threatened to unravel everything. One afternoon, Claire received a call from her sister, Emma. They hadn't spoken much since the fallout of Claire's affair, their relationship strained by the weight of judgment and disappointment. "Claire, I need to tell you something," Emma said, her tone serious. Claire's stomach knotted. "What is it?" "I ran into Adam at a work event last week," Emma said. He asked about you." Claire's heart sank. "What did you tell him?" "I told him you were trying to fix things with Dan," Emma said. "But Claire, he didn't seem like he was ready to let go." The words hit Claire like a punch to the gut. She thought she'd put Adam behind her, but his shadow loomed larger than she'd realized. That evening, she debated whether to tell Dan they'd worked so hard to rebuild trust. Would mentioning Adam jeopardize everything? Meanwhile, Dan was wrestling with his own doubts. The progress they'd made felt real, but fragile. He couldn't shake the fear that one wrong move would send them spiraling back into chaos. And then there was Sarah. Their friendship had been a source of comfort during his darkest days, but now it felt like a complication. He'd grown to care about her more than he was willing to admit, and the guilt of that realization weighed heavily on him. One evening, Sarah called him. "Hey, I was thinking we should grab dinner sometime," she said casually. "It's been a while." Dan hesitated. He valued Sarah's friendship, but he knew that spending time with her now might blur lines he couldn't afford to cross. "I don't think that's a good idea," he said finally. There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Dan, are you okay?" "I'm fine," he said, though his voice betrayed his uncertainty. I need to focus on Claire right now." Sarah sighed, her tone understanding but tinged with disappointment. "I get it. Just know I'm here if you ever need to talk." After hanging up, Dan sat in the quiet of his apartment, his mind a whirlwind of emotions. He didn't want to lose Sarah's friendship, but he couldn't deny that his feelings for her had complicated everything. For the first time, he wondered if trying to reconcile with Claire was the right choice, or if he was simply clinging to a past that no longer fit. The tension between Claire and Dan reached a boiling point when Claire finally told him about Emma's call. They were sitting in the kitchen, the air between them heavy with unspoken truths. "Dan, there's something I need to tell you," Claire said, her voice trembling. "Emma ran into Adam last week. He asked about me." Dan's expression hardened. "What did she say?" "She told him I was trying to fix things with you," Claire said quickly. "But I thought you should know." Dan leaned back in his chair, his jaw tight. "Why is he still asking about you? I thought this was over." "It is over," Claire said, her voice rising with desperation. "I haven't spoken to him, Dan. I deleted his message. Remember, I don't want anything to do with him." Dan's eyes searched hers, his emotions swirling just beneath the surface. "I want to believe you," he said finally. "But every time his name comes up, it feels like we're back at square one." Claire reached for his hand, her grip firm but gentle. "I can't control what he does, Dan, but I can control what I do, and I'm telling you the truth because I don't want any more secrets between us." Dan nodded slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. "Okay," he said, "but if he reaches out again, I need to know." "You will," Claire promised. "I swear." The turning point came during a trip to the lake, the same place where they'd spent so many summers together. The crisp air and serene water offered a sense of calm they both desperately needed. Sitting on the dock, their feet dangling over the edge, they finally let their walls down. "Do you think we'll ever be happy again?" Claire asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Dan stared out at the water, his expression thoughtful. "I don't know," he admitted. "But I think we owe it to ourselves to try." Claire nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I'm scared. Dan's scared that I'll mess it up again." "We're both scared," Dan said, his hand reaching for hers. "But fear doesn't have to define us." For the first time, Claire allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could find their way back to each other. And that's where we leave them, standing on the edge of a new beginning. The road ahead won't be easy, but they're ready to face it together. What do you think? Can Claire and Dan truly rebuild what was lost, or is their story destined to end in heartbreak? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter in this powerful journey. The trip to the lake had been a turning point for Claire and Dan, a brief moment of peace in the storm that had engulfed their lives. But as they returned home, reality settled back in, bringing with it the unresolved tension that continued to bubble beneath the surface. Claire threw herself into work, determined to prove, to herself as much as to Dan, that she was capable of being the person he deserved. She volunteered for extra projects, mentored new teachers, and even started leading an after-school program for at-risk students. On the surface, she seemed to be thriving, but inside, the weight of her guilt and the fear of failure loomed large. Dan, meanwhile, found himself struggling to reconcile his emotions. He wanted to believe in Claire's sincerity, to trust that she was committed to their reconciliation. But every now and then, the doubts crept in, whispering reminders of the betrayal that had nearly destroyed him. He knew it wasn't fair to hold the past over her, especially when she was working so hard to make amends. Yet the scars ran deep, and healing wasn't something he could rush. The cracks in their fragile peace widened when Adam reappeared, this time in person. It happened on a Saturday morning. Claire was at a local cafe, grading papers over a cup of coffee when she looked up and saw him standing in line. Her heart stopped. He hadn't seen her yet, and for a moment, she considered slipping out before he noticed her, but then his eyes met hers, and it was too late. "Claire," he said, a smile spreading across his face as he approached her table. "Wow, it's been a while." Claire's stomach churned. "Adam, what are you doing here?" "Just grabbing coffee," he said, gesturing to the counter. "Didn't expect to see you. How have you been?" "Fine," Claire said tersely, her eyes darting around the cafe. She prayed no one she knew was watching. "Busy." Adam's smile faltered slightly. "I've been thinking about you," he said, his voice dropping. "I know things ended abruptly between us, but I miss you, Claire." Claire's chest tightened. "Adam, this isn't appropriate. I'm trying to work things out with my husband." Adam leaned closer, his expression earnest. "Do you really think that's possible after everything that happened?" Claire stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "I do. And I don't want to hear from you again, Adam. Please respect that." Before he could respond, Claire grabbed her things and walked out, her hands shaking as she fumbled with her car keys. She knew she needed to tell Dan, but the thought of how he might react filled her with dread. When Claire finally worked up the courage to tell Dan about the encounter, his reaction was immediate and explosive. "He approached you at a cafe?" Dan's voice was sharp, his expression a mixture of anger and disbelief. "Why didn't you call me right then and there?" "I didn't want to make a scene," Claire said, her voice trembling. "I told him I didn't want to see him again, Dan. I handled it." "Handled it?" Dan said, his tone incredulous. "Claire, every time his name comes up, it feels like I'm reliving this nightmare all over again. How am I supposed to believe this is behind us when he keeps showing up?" Claire's eyes filled with tears. "I can't control what he does, Dan. But I can control how I respond, and I chose you. I'll always choose you." Dan stared at her for a long moment, his anger slowly giving way to exhaustion. "I want to believe that," he said finally. "But it's hard, Claire. It's really hard." The confrontation left them both emotionally drained, and for the first time since they'd begun rebuilding their relationship, Claire felt a flicker of doubt. Was it too late? Had they done too much damage to ever truly recover? In the days that followed, she threw herself even harder into her work, staying late at school and volunteering for weekend events. Dan, too, buried himself in his job, the distance between them growing with each passing day. It wasn't until Claire's therapist confronted her during a session that she realized how much she'd been avoiding. "Claire, you've made incredible progress," her therapist said. "But I can't help but notice that you're running yourself ragged. What are you afraid of?" Claire hesitated, her hands twisting in her lap. "That it's not enough," she admitted. "That no matter how hard I try, I'll never be able to fix what I broke. Her therapist leaned forward, her gaze compassionate but firm. Claire, rebuilding a relationship isn't about fixing the past. It's about creating something new. But that requires both of you to be fully present. The words stayed with Claire long after the session ended. She knew her therapist was right. If she wanted any chance of saving her marriage, she needed to stop running from her fears and start facing them head-on. Dan was having his own moment of reckoning one evening. As he sat alone in his apartment, he found himself scrolling through old photos of him and Claire. There was one picture in particular that caught his attention, taken on their anniversary a few years ago. They were standing on a beach, the sun setting behind them, their smiles wide and genuine. As he stared at the photo, Dan realized something he hadn't been willing to admit before. He missed her. Not just the woman she'd been before the affair, but the woman she was now, the one who was fighting so hard to make things right. Despite everything, he still loved her. The realization hit him like a wave, and for the first time in months, Dan allowed himself to hope. Maybe their story wasn't over yet. The climactic moment came during a dinner date that Dan planned as a surprise. He hadn't told Claire where they were going, only that she should dress up and be ready by 7. When she stepped into the restaurant, her breath caught. It was the same place where they'd celebrated their engagement, the memories flooding back in an instant. They were seated at a corner table, the candlelight casting a warm glow over their faces. For a while, they talked about light-hearted topics, work, hobbies, their favorite TV shows. But as the evening went on, the conversation turned serious. "Why did you bring me here?" Claire asked softly, her eyes searching his. Dan took a deep breath. "Because I wanted to remind us of what we're fighting for," he said. "Of the love we had, the love we still have." Claire's throat tightened. "Dan, I know I've made mistakes, huge mistakes, but I'll spend the rest of my life making it up to you if you'll let me." Dan reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "I'm tired of living in the past, Claire. I want to move forward with you." Tears streamed down Claire's face as she nodded, her heart swelling with a mix of relief and gratitude. "I want that too," she said. The dinner marked a turning point, a moment of renewed commitment that felt more genuine and grounded than ever before. But the journey wasn't over yet. There were still challenges to face, still wounds to heal, but for the first time, they both felt ready to face them, together. What do you think? Are Claire and Dan finally on the path to healing? Or are the shadows of their past too deep to overcome? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss the final chapter of this emotional journey. The weeks following the dinner date felt different, not perfect, but better. Claire and Dan had turned a corner, their renewed commitment a foundation on which they could begin to rebuild. The lingering pain of their past hadn't disappeared overnight, but for the first time, they were facing it as a team rather than as adversaries. One of the first signs of real progress came when Claire suggested they attend a weekend retreat for couples. "It's about communication and rebuilding trust," she explained, her voice tentative. "I think it could help us." Dan hesitated at first, skeptical about the idea of sharing their struggles in a group setting. But seeing the hope in Claire's eyes, he agreed. "If you think it'll help, I'm in," he said. The retreat proved to be a turning point in more ways than one. Through guided exercises, Claire and Dan learned how to express their feelings without fear of judgment, how to listen to each other with empathy, and how to rebuild the trust that had been broken. One particularly emotional moment came during an exercise where they were asked to write letters to each other. Sitting in a quiet corner of the retreat center, Dan poured his heart onto the page. He wrote about the pain he'd felt, the doubts that had haunted him, and the love that had persisted despite everything. "You hurt me, Claire," he wrote. "But you also showed me that love isn't about never making mistakes. It's about choosing each other, even when it's hard, and I'm choosing you." When Claire read his letter later that evening, tears streamed down her face. She'd written her own letter, filled with apologies, gratitude, and promises for the future. "I can't undo what I did," she wrote, "but I can promise to love you with everything I have from this moment forward." They exchanged letters by the fire, their hands trembling as they read each other's words. When they looked up, their eyes met, and for the first time in months, the weight between them felt lighter. Returning from the retreat, Claire and Dan found themselves falling into a new rhythm. They made time for date nights, set boundaries around work to prioritize their relationship, and continued counseling to ensure they stayed on track. Slowly but surely, the wounds began to heal. One day, while organizing the garage, Claire stumbled upon a box of old keepsakes from their early years together. Inside, she found the photo album they'd started during their honeymoon, a collection of snapshots capturing their happiest moments. She brought it to Dan, who smiled as he flipped through the pages. "Remember this?" he asked, pointing to a picture of them standing in front of a rickety rental car. "How could I forget?" Claire said with a laugh. "We thought that car was going to fall apart before we made it back to the hotel." They spent the afternoon reminiscing, the memories reminding them of the love that had always been the foundation of their relationship. It wasn't about erasing the pain of the past, but about reclaiming the joy that had once defined them. Meanwhile, Dan found closure in another area of his life, his friendship with Sarah. He invited her to coffee one afternoon, wanting to address the unspoken tension that had lingered since their last conversation. "Sarah, I need to thank you," he said, his tone earnest. "You were there for me when I didn't know how to move forward, and I'll always be grateful for that." Sarah smiled, though her eyes glimmered with emotion. "You don't have to thank me, Dan. I'm just glad you're finding your way." They parted on good terms, both understanding that their friendship had served its purpose. Dan left the cafe feeling a sense of peace, ready to focus fully on his future with Claire. The final test of their relationship came when Claire received a call from Adam, her last loose end. She didn't hesitate this time, answering with a steady voice. "Adam, I told you I don't want to hear from you again. I just need to talk," he said, his tone pleading. "Can we meet one last time?" "No," Claire said firmly. "There's nothing left to say. I'm moving forward with my husband, and I suggest you do the same." She hung up without waiting for a response, the sound of the dial tone feeling like a victory. When she told Dan about the call, his reaction surprised her. "I'm proud of you," he said simply, "not just for shutting him down, but for choosing us." Months turned into a year, and Claire and Dan found themselves in a place they hadn't dared to hope for. Happy, not because life was perfect, but because they had built something stronger than what they'd had before. They celebrated their anniversary with a quiet dinner at home, exchanging small gifts and heartfelt words. "You know," Dan said as they clinked their glasses of wine, "I think this might be our best year yet." Claire smiled, her heart full. "I think so too." In the final scene, we see Claire and Dan sitting on their porch, the sun setting in the distance. They're holding hands, their laughter filling the air as they reminisce about a recent trip to the beach. The camera pans out, capturing the warmth and love that now defines their relationship, a testament to the power of forgiveness, growth, and second chances. And that's the story of Claire and Dan, a journey of heartbreak, healing, and hope. What did you think of their journey? Let me know in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my channel for more emotional recaps like this one. Until next time, take care and remember, even the hardest roads can lead to beautiful destinations.